Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the August 18th, 2018 edition of Collect Our Cousins, Engaging White People in the Struggle for Full Democracy. I'm Karen Fleshman, your host, and I'm the founder of Racy Conversations and of Collect Our Cousins. And I'm so honored today to be joined by my good friend, Jeena Cho.
Hi,
I'd like to share a little
Karen.
bit about why I created Collect Our Cousins. I created this weekly live stream to help white Americans like me become more effective in our conversations with white people in our lives, to help us build an an embodied anti-racist white culture, in the words of Resma Menachem. I'm featuring the people who inspire and teach me the most, like Jeena. White Americans, the battle for our democracy will not be won in courtrooms or in the streets. It must be won in white living rooms, in our neighborhood meetings, in our school board meetings. As an anti racist, collecting my cousins often falls to the end of my to do list. Oh, I'll get to that next month. But I want to encourage everyone watching here today to make a list of our white friends and family we will collect this year and start to reach out to them. There are 21 million Americans, largely white, who believe that Donald Trump is the legitimate president and political violence may be necessary to restore him to office. And it's up to us to be on the front line, not just of trying to reach that group, but reaching people who are neutral or in the middle or leaning toward our side, but not fully invested in it. And we are the front line for reaching that group. So with that in mind, I would love to welcome, and I see Andrea Payne has joined us. Thank you so much, Andrea, for coming. And thank you, Jeena, for being here this morning. It's so good to see you.
So good to see you, Karen.
How are you feeling today?
I'm good. How about you?
I am good. It's the second day of school. It's a little bit hectic,
Mm,
lots of forms, and I'm running for school board. Gina, thank you so much for contributing to my campaign and
yes,
helping. And
absolutely. I got you.
thank you. Yes, I will drop a link to my Act Blue in the chat. If you support me, if you support my message and my values, please do support me for San Francisco School Board, and please do run for school board in your own jurisdiction because we need anti-racist school board members. But let's put that to the side. Why don't you share a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah. So my name is Jeena Cho. I am a recovering attorney. Although I don't know how I feel about that term. I co-authored a book titled The Anxious Lawyer. So I spent a lot of time just struggling with anxiety while I was practicing law. And then I stumbled upon mindfulness and meditation, and it just completely transformed my life. And then I think more recently, thanks to you, I've been doing a lot of work around embodied anti-racism or embodying abolitionism, I think is the term that Resma uses, and really doing a deep dive around, my own privilege as an Asian American, what it means to be white adjacent, what it means to kind of occupy that role of being the model minority, which I very much subscribe to and wholeheartedly embrace just because of my immigrant background. I think that was sort of the myth that was sold to me. And having to just sort of like deconstruct and really understand how that myth of the model minority really harms everyone, including Asian Americans. And I am a mom, and I have a 3-year-old. I'm married. Yeah. So
Awesome. And I just love our really deep conversations, Gina, because I think there's so many, although obviously we're very different in terms of our positions and races and lived experiences, we also have a lot in common. I'm a lawyer, recovering lawyer, um, also a mom, also someone dedicated to embodied anti-racism practice like that Resma leads, and um, and also someone who's carrying a lot of intergenerational trauma. So maybe let's start the conversation there. I think we all, like white women. I'll speak for white women. The system will reward us with tiny amounts of power for upholding the system. And that has been true all the way throughout American history. And so we are continuously conditioned to uphold the system, and we were literally brought to this country to bear white heirs and to maintain the intergenerational wealth transfer of white supremacy, and to police the plantation, to be like an extra set of eyes and ears to enforce white supremacy. And that's been our role for 500 years. Um, and for the longest time, I dwelt in so much guilt and shame about that history. And just through Resma's work, so many of my mentors had told me, Karen, you need to peel back and you need to really study. Well, why did your ancestors leave Europe? And I was like, I don't even feel connected to those people. Like, why?
Mhm.
My ancestors are the oppressors. Why on earth would I want to learn more about my ancestors? I kept trying to distance myself from my ancestors. But then just literally this year, I read the book The Caliban and the Witch by Sylvia Federici, which if you have not read, I highly recommend everyone read.
Not read the book. What is it called again?
The Caliban, Caliban, and the Witch. And it is the history of the witch hunt in Europe. And
Hmm.
basically, it's written by Sylvia Federici, who is a feminist Marxist. And what she writes about is how um, the elites use the witch hunt to break the peasant resistance to the onslaught of capitalism. And it was right at that same, the peak of the witch hunt was 1550 to 1650. It was right as they were beginning the colonization, beginning the transatlantic slave trade, beginning the land theft and genocide of Native Americans. And so prior to that period, there weren't really defined gender roles, and women actually held a lot of power, and a lot of resources were held collectively. There was this, like, people farmed on the commons. They raised crops and tended animals on the commons. So they spent a lot of time collectively. And women were healers and midwives and spiritual leaders. And they had professions like ale makers and stuff like that. So women held considerable amount of power, and things were held collectively. Then the elites were like, no, 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 we're taking over your land, and now you're going to have to be sharecroppers, and we're going to define these gender roles, and we're going to do all of these things to really minimize both your collective power and women's power. And some women were like, screw you, you can't do that to me. And those were the ones they accused of being witches. And then they would kill them in these public spectacles of violence with the whole town out there clapping and cheering. And then they would, bring their daughters, bring their children to watch their mothers burn at the stake. So when I read that, I was like, shit, that is my intergenerational trauma. That is why women were willing to leave England and come to the colonies, because they were trying to get away from that. But then they brought the freaking witch hunt over here. I'm not trying to legitimize or excuse white women's behavior, but I will say I gained a very, very deeper appreciation for how we turned out the way we did from reading that. And I didn't want to go so long on that point, but I
Mhm.
know you've been doing a lot of intergenerational trauma
Yeah.
exploration on your own. And I think there's some parallels in there.
Yeah, and I think I just want to say, like, recognizing your own intergenerational trauma doesn't take away from other people's trauma, right? It's not a comparison. There's no, suffering contest here. And I think the brilliance of Resma's work is that he puts bodies together. So white bodies are with other white bodies doing this work, because I can only imagine how charged it would be, right? For example, if you were trying to have this conversation in a group of Black and Brown, majority group, or even Asian Americans. So I think we all have our own set of intergenerational trauma, and we need to find other people who share that similar trauma so that we can start to process it. And I've just benefited so hugely. And of course, not of course every Asian has the same set of intergenerational trauma, just like white Europeans don't as well, right? So I think it's really a worthwhile exploration to kind of explore that. So for me, the intergenerational trauma came up because, my mom always told me this story, right? But I didn't really, I guess, pay attention to it. But when the war in Ukraine broke out, my mom called, and I can tell she was very somber and she was very sad. And she's usually a very stoic person. She's very much like, I don't know how to describe it. Like not an emotional person at all. And she told me that she was watching the war on the news, and seeing all the refugees and the children. And she said that she started to cry, and just like uncontrollably just sobbing. And she said, and I realized that the sadness that I was releasing wasn't just from the war that she was witnessing on TV, that it brought back her own childhood. And she tells me this story about her mom, right? So my grandma, my grandfather was imprisoned when the Korean War broke out. He was a political prisoner. So my mom, or my grandmother, fled sort of like the northern part of the country and migrated to the southern part of the country with her son, so my mom's brother, who was 3 years old and pregnant with my mom. And she stopped in an abandoned building and gave birth to my mom as bombs were falling and the buildings all around them were collapsing. And she tells me this story, and like just something clicked in my brain. I think it's all the work that I've been doing with Resma, and I realized, oh, you know what, like just so much of that like that lingering anxiety. I remember being a small child and feeling that sense of anxiety, like feeling like, oh, like something isn't right, like, oh, like there's something to be alarmed about here. And I realized, oh, I wonder if that just sense of um, anxiety, that was just ever so present in my life, came about because of, the experience that my mom had. And I think that's true, right? And I think, just like doing a little bit of research around epigenetics, and, of course, when my mom was born, all women are born with all the eggs that they'll ever have, right? And so I was sort of in existence, granted as a single cell, egg in my mom's ovaries, but, and I think it makes sense, right? That I was sort of experienced that. And also I think just that sense of like perfectionism, that I have to overperform and over deliver, because the alternative was, like a catastrophic collapse, right? It wasn't even just like, oh, you're not going to get the job. It was almost like, I'm just going to become like destitute and homeless. I think a lot of that, just comes from, right, of course, the war ended, like 18 months after my mom was born, and just like living through the recovery process. So just a lot of that really hard work ethic, like overwork, was just a really normal part of my parents' generation, certainly my grandparents' generation, and how much of that I adopted into my own life without examining it, without realizing it, right? And it just begins to kind of look like culture, like, Resma says.
Yeah. And the amount of cortisol and stress hormones, like just from that birth story. That is so intense. Not to mention that while she was pregnant, like the experience of having her partner imprisoned, having to flee, trying to help her 3-year-old son while she's pregnant. I'm sure she didn't have any, like, who was there with her?
Right,
Was
they didn't have diapers. And I'm just like trying to imagine this scenario. I mean, I have a 3-year-old now, and just walking hundreds of miles with her, like while I'm pregnant, and you know just how exhausted you are when you're pregnant, and just like this the physical stress of it. And it just kind of gave me a different level of, I think, understanding and empathy, and compassion for, for my mom, and I think for myself. Yeah.
yeah.
Just kind of
And
like learning our stories. For me, that's actually like an act of collecting your cousins, because you have to like own your stories and love them and make sense of it and process it. And then you can share that with your other family members, because that's something that you guys share.
yes, yes. For me, it's been really amazing during the pandemic. I'm adopted at as an infant, and I had never, because my relationship with my the parents who adopted me, who are my parents, was so satisfying that I had never felt like, oh, I need to know who my birth parents are, or I'm missing some really big element of my identity. But a lot of my mentors have been like, Karen, you should find out who your birth parents are and what that story is. And randomly, I met this amazing Black woman in December of 2019 who convinced me that I should do it because she had done it. She had found her birth parents. So literally that night, I went and I got an ancestry kit, and I got the results back in February of 2020, and it said, with 100% certainty, this is your parent. But at that point I wasn't, I I was like, whoa, like I still wasn't ready to contact that person. But then, like, um the pandemic hit, and I was like, oh dang, like what if this person passed away and I didn't contact them. So that led me to contact them. Bottom line, this has been such an amazing journey of self-discovery and just realization, and I think it's just caused my level of empathy to
Mm.
grow so much. Empathy for other people, empathy for myself as well. And now, as a mom myself, like, what am I doing to heal from all of that intergenerational trauma and be the cycle breaker so I don't pass that on to my kids?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just what you said, being a cycle breaker is like, I think what we're all inspiring to do, right? Like, we want to break the cycle of white body supremacy and all the isms. But I think part of that is just like reckoning with it personally, and that's the hardest part, is to like look inwards and do the internal work. Yeah.
Yeah, and coming to terms as a white person with all the ways that you and your ancestors have benefited from this. A lot of white people are like, oh, well, I'm not descended from slave owners, and I'm not this, and I'm not that. You know what? It does not freaking matter. It does not matter if you are a white immigrant. We all benefit from this in some way. And it's in all of our self interest. We are always rewarded for being complicit with it. The minute that we start to turn against it, oh my God, then all heck breaks loose. And I try not to be judgmental, but I'm also like, are we get what broke my heart is seeing Frederick Douglass's great grandchildren recorded his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." I don't know if you saw this. So
Mm.
in the 18 I guess in the 1850s or early 60s, Frederick Douglass made a speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," on the 4th of July. And it's all about, you're out there celebrating your freedom, but what about us, you know?
Mhm.
And then, like, in the summer, I guess it was the summer of 2021, his great grandchildren made a video. I'll put that in the notes too. Made a video of them saying his exact same speech.
Oh
And
my
literally, it's all freaking the same. I mean, it's like we have a responsibility, white people. We have a responsibility to end racism. It, we have to do it. Like, no one's going to force us to do it. We have to decide that this is no longer something we want to be a part of, and we have to actively engage in dismantling it. And I know it's uncomfortable, but let me tell you, what we gain from doing this is so great. And you will feel terrible for a long period of time, but then when you start to get on the other edge of the hill, you will feel, like, so embraced and so good. I'm sorry, again, I'm, like, talking a
God.
lot.
Well, what you're talking about reminds me of Brian Stevenson, who, if you don't know his work, I mean, he's just like, I feel like he's a saint walking amongst us. He wrote the book Just Mercy. He founded EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative. He's argued multiple cases at the Supreme Court level for the weak, the vulnerable, the most marginalized, and I love him. But there was an interview, and I can send you the link for that he did with Jon Stewart. And in that interview, he says, imagine a world where we're not spending all of this resources trying to dismantle white supremacy, like all the DEI initiative, because we fixed it, right? We've, like, on a systems level, addressed all of these inequalities and inequities. Imagine taking all of that, and also not placing that burden on our children, right? Just how liberating that would be. And then also taking all of that money and resources and, like, putting it elsewhere. And
Using it to solve climate change.
and I just had this, like,
Unbelievable.
vision, right? Like, kind of going back to what Resma, the Vumbasi, where you go through and connect with your physiological experience. Well, part of it is, like, you're bringing in your imagination. So, like, just what Karen, you were saying, like, imagine a world, right, where we are not continuing to systematically oppress those who are already marginalized, and creating a world, a better world. Sorry, my daughter just left. You want to say hi? Say hi.
Hi, Simone.
Hi. Oh boy, you've got.
How are you? Good morning.
Good morning. So this is my 3-year-old.
Hello.
Yeah, and I think so much about all of these topics because my daughter is half Korean and half white, and and I want her to I think like, of course, know the history, right, of this country, and also not not live in that place of shame, right? Because I think so many people sort of get stuck there, and for her to just have fluency around all of these issues and who she is, and it's also given me a lot to reflect on, like, how I talk about race and racism, and just keeping in mind that whenever I say, like, white people blah blah blah, I'm also including her in that bucket. And but I think the how Resma approaches the work of anti-racism, for me, just makes so much sense, because what he invites you to do is to sit with the physical discomfort of talking about these issues. And I feel it, right? Like, I know that when I go in to do a training to a mostly white audience, when I say the words white people, there's a shift of energy in the room, right? And I think what we're practicing is to sit with that that physiological change that happens in your body and learn how to tolerate the discomfort of having these very, very challenging conversations. And if we are not tempering and conditioning our bodies so that we can sit in a room, right, where we're having these really charged conversations or talking to our family members about these issues, that we don't sort of go into that fight or flight or flee mode, right? That we can stay present and not default to, our habitual patterns.
Yes, of deny, deflect, defend, depart, escalate.
Yeah.
Yes. How can we sit in that conversation with our cousins and remain empathetic and really help them to parse through? I just did yesterday. My mentor and I co-facilitated 2 listening sessions. One with the bodies of culture on a team and the other with the white bodies on a team. And my mentor was like, "You are like the racial therapist," because I was literally like walking these through the walking white people through, like, how do we start to look ourselves in the mirror and not just read the books, but actually look at, what am I doing personally? What am I doing in my work environment to uphold white supremacy? And how do I start to shift away from that toward a new way of being? How do I learn how to let go of my desire to be the leader, to be the dominant, and instead learn how to be part of the collective and to be an equal and to relate across difference as equals and to actually decenter my own experience when I've been conditioned throughout my life to believe I am supreme and my experience is the only experience that matters. And I should aspire to being the dominant. If I'm not aspiring to being the dominant, then I'm a loser.
Yeah, so much to deconstruct there, like just our conditioning. And and also I didn't really notice or pay attention to the fact that this is how we are conditioned, in this society, that if you're white, you just assume, right? Like if you're in like a mixed group, and you're a white person, it's like I always speak first, and everything I say matters. And how I've also been conditioned to not take up space, of how I spend so much time putting my, be like, okay, I have a thought. And then I have like this 14-layer filter that I put the thought through before I can say something. And I find I do that a lot, especially in groups where it's, majority white. And that's often the case because of the work that I do and, because in law. And how when I started to do the work with Resma in my triad, so I'm in a triad with 2 other Asian American sisters, just that layer of filtering that I've been doing all of my life just wasn't there. And I was like, oh, this is different. I mean, I can just say, without like hyper processing the thought. Because often, by time like I go, okay, now I have the perfect thing that I'm going to say, the moment has passed and the meeting,
For a little bit.
Yes, if I give you the watch, can you go downstairs and hang out with Daddy for a little bit so I can finish the call?
Yeah,
okay. I'll put my watch on you, and then I need you to go downstairs and hang out with
I
Daddy.
want Dad to do it.
Okay, then Daddy can do it. Okay, can you close the door behind you, please? All right, go see Daddy. Close the door behind you, please. Thank you.
As you were talking, I was thinking about that diagram from CocoNet of the problem woman of color in the workplace, where the woman of color enters the workplace, and at first it's the honeymoon period where the white leadership is so excited. We're finally becoming more diverse. Then, as the woman of color spends more time there, she's subjected to repetitive injury and microaggressions. So when she starts to speak to the white leadership and says, hey, this needs to change, that needs to change, Instead of listening to her and actually changing, the white leadership turns and points the finger at her. No, no, no. You are the problem. You are making this up. We're not the problem. And we're going to start to harm you. And then she either quits or is fired.
Right. And that, that happens all the time. I mean, I don't imagine there's a scenario where you're the lonely only or the lonely few in an organization and you don't experience that, and I think regardless of sort of what your own, status is, whether it's, sexual orientation or, race, or I can also imagine it happening with gender if you work with a mostly male population. And I think, I didn't really realize, just what you said, like, when you speak up and they're like, you're crazy. And then I go, oh, am I crazy? Like, am I really making this up in my head? And the work that I've been doing, just the work that I've been doing with Resma has been so healing, because it's like, I started to speak up about these experiences that white people told me were like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. But then I see all of my other, Asian American siblings nodding their head, and I go, oh, okay, I'm not crazy. It's just so validating, right? And because we live, in these very white spaces, we don't really, and I never really thought about, the importance of having other like Asian American friends, until I started doing the work with Resma, which is so crazy.
Well, I'm much the same way. I was like, when I started going down the white anti-racist path, I was like, let me distance myself as far away as possible from other white people. And when Rez was like, oh no, white people in this movement, you have one role, and that is to collect your cousins and to turn toward white people. I was like, toward white people? I don't want to do that. I want to hang out with all my like radical friends of color and be a part of the movement. Why on earth would I want to be? But when you read Malcolm X, that's exactly what he said too. When I talk to my mentors, that's exactly what they say too. So it's like when you start to hear the same story over and over again, you're like, perhaps there's some validity to this, and I need to start doing that. And I think that's another way our movement doesn't get bigger, right? If the white people who join the movement, the first thing we try and do is tear down other white people who are in the movement or distance ourselves from white people, that means we'll only ever be a teeny tiny group. Whereas if we want to have real power, all of our efforts should be focused on expanding participation. And there may be white allies that you don't agree with 100%. That is okay. You don't have to be exactly aligned in everything to both be committed to working toward anti-racism and supporting each other, and supporting each other also emotionally. I think, because we're told, oh, white tears, don't cry white tears, which I totally understand. We center ourselves and center our feelings. Oh, I'm being harmed now as a white person. That is terrible and destructive. However, there are so many genuine tears of grief when you come into consciousness about how much harm our ancestors have caused, how much harm I have caused, we have caused collectively. Genuine tears of grief are a whole other matter. And we need to be with other white people to cry those genuine tears.
I think that's the key, is doing it with other white people, right?
Yes.
Just like I have to do my own healing with my other, my Asian American siblings. I think that's, or I can just imagine how triggering that would be for, I don't know, like for a Black person or for another marginalized person to have to like sit there with, a white person. I don't know. I mean, maybe, and, it also occurred to me that this kind of, how we turn away from white people when we begin to do that work is actually perpetuating white body supremacy,
100%.
We can't fight, white body supremacy with like hate, greed, delusion, like all of these things that white body supremacy has sort of embedded in us. So now we have to figure out, okay, like how do I show up more compassionately, right? How do I show up with more love? And believe me, it is really, really freaking hard.
It is hard.
It is so hard. Yeah.
But my mentor, Sweetwater Nana, talks about this all the time. She's a native Alaskan Tlingit woman. And she talks about how so much of that native activism is really led by spirit and led by love. And white activism is led by fear and anger. And she says that's why white activism is so ineffective, because you can't make change with fear and anger. You can only make change with love and spirit. And we have to like listen to spirit and let spirit guide us. And I'm like, listen to spirit, like what? I don't, and this is all part of the process, right? We have to let go and metabolize our fear and anger, because it's real, and I'm feeling more fearful than ever as I go around Northern California, and even sometimes in San Francisco, seeing the people with the no quarter given baseball hats and the blue line, Blue Lives Matter, and all the hateful stickers and flags and everything. Like the dominance of white supremacy in visual space right now is really intense. So that causes me to feel like fear and anger. And then I have to like melt back down and like get back into love. And how am I going to counteract all this hateful energy with healing, loving energy?
Yeah. Just something that you brought up totally reminded me, there's just so much horrible events unfolding, right now, every day. I don't know. And there was like that 1 week, like was it last month or the month before? It was like the anniversary of George Floyd murder. And then there was like multiple murders for like surrounding that whole week. And then a couple of weeks later, like Roe decision came out, the overturning Roe. And I was just in a place of like, I don't know how to hold all of this trauma. Like I don't know how to hold all of this sadness. Like how do I even begin to like what does it mean to be processing it? Like, and shouldn't I be fighting against it? And like what's my role in this? And then we went camping, and like I saw the sunrise, and then it was just such a, and also like I have a very long-standing meditation practice. So I think it's helpful from that perspective. But and I think just that's almost like that's like life, right? It's like, oh, there's like all of these awful things that are happening, and look, like the sun is still rising and there's still beauty around me. And I like in that moment, just like holding those two truths together. Yeah, like I didn't even know like how to, right? Because there was a part of me that's like, oh, look at the sun, like the sunrise is so beautiful, and I can feel the warmth as the sun is coming up, and looking up at the sky and seeing the colors change, and then part of me was like, oh no, but you can't be too joyous, because look, there's like so much fucking awful shit happening right now. And then I would like think about all the awful stuff. But then I would look, and it's like, no, but like right now I'm camping and the sun is rising, and it's okay for me to like take refuge in that, right? So that I can like restore and recharge, so that I can go out, right, and continue to, I don't know, resist and to persist. And yeah, and that it's like I think part of the hard part is like these are like tiny little incremental changes, right? And I think some people just want these like huge sweeping changes. And then yes, there is definitely a space for that, and that can happen. But for me, sort of like where I am, it's just really like taking delight in the in the little things. which aren't really so little anyway, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
those are the things that make up life.
What's coming up for me is I always end my workshops with this quote from Lao Tzu. If you want to end the darkness in the world, then eliminate all that is dark within yourself. If you want to change the world, change yourself. Like, truly, the greatest gift we have to give is that of our own self transformation. Because I think it's really easy to be like, oh my God, this is terrible. Those people are terrible. That is terrible. That is terrible. But we don't have any control over those people. What we have control over is our own selves. And as we start to transform, as the energy that radiates out of us transforms to being this healing, positive, loving energy, that sends ripples out into the world that we don't even know where those ripples land. And then as we start to come together, in my white triad, we talk about how, we're all these teeny tiny little droplets of water. But when the droplets like find each other, then we become a pond, then we become a lake, then we become an ocean, and this like healing, cooling, energy just expands. So that is how I like to think about it. And I'm so grateful that you took the time to appreciate and be present and to drink in that sunset, that sunrise, and not allow all this stuff going on around us to prevent you from enjoying that moment.
Yeah, and and I think I'll just end with this. It's my meditation teacher was very fond of saying that it is your birthright to have your own mind be kind to itself. I think also to add to that, it is your birthright to experience joy, right? And I think like white body supremacy really like deprives us from connecting with that inner sense of satisfaction that we can experience in life. Just not to say that the work isn't hard, but what I really notice is I'm doing this work of embodied somatic abolitionism is just this really swelling of joy and also and I think that's the fuel, right, that gets me going. And
yes, and when we study, when I study the ancestors in the abolitionist movement, they knew that they were not going to see the end of slavery in their lifetime, but they kept at it. They kept working every single day, and they kept uniting with other people who saw the world the way they did, and they raised up their kids to continue the movement after they were done, because they knew that someday it would come to an end, and that was their work to do. So that's what I'm going to keep doing too. And I'm so grateful to be walking on this path with you, Jeena, and learning from you and sharing with you and supporting you. I want to ask you at the end of this show, I always ask, if you could wave a magic wand and get white people to either start doing something or stop doing something, what would it be and why?
Yeah. If I could just wave the wand, I would just have white people really start calling things out as they are, right? And that's so freaking hard. I was just doing a training on, and I think it's such a common experience for people of color, attorneys of color, but, going into a courtroom and being mistaken for the court reporter or the defendant or, the clerk or some other. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about what should the person of color do, but we often don't talk about what's the responsibility of all the other white people standing in the courtroom, right? All the other attorneys. And I think you have to call that shit out. Of course, in a way that is, that makes sense for the moment, that's respectable, whatever. But to stand silent in that moment, right, when somebody is clearly demonstrating it, and I think at its most generous, their implicit bias. And I think, I think that's a very generous view. But if you're standing silent, like you're complicit in that. And I think there is just so much of that complicity happening everywhere with white people. But I think first, it requires a level of awareness, right, of these issues. Because if you're like, oh, what's the big deal? Then obviously you can't name the problem. I think just becoming aware of the problem and then naming it. And naming it is hard. It's like when you're sitting in a meeting and then a person of color throws an idea out, everybody moves along, and then 6 person later, some other white dude says exactly what the thing that the person of color said, and they get the credit. And I think you have to be the one who's brave enough in the room to say, oh, you know what, when when whoever said that was a really good point, and I appreciate you bringing that back up. Right. And so I think there's like a way, and I think that requires awareness and practicing, and I think that's something that you can easily practice with your other white people on how to do. Like, hey, like, how would you speak up in this moment?
Noticing and naming. Listen up, white people. We hear from Karen. Oh, my mentor, Karen Clofton, is on.
Hi.
Joy is resistance. Black joy and love equal resistance. Every generation must fight anew for freedom. Yes. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for being a guiding force in my life in the fight for freedom. Jeena, how can people be in touch with you and where to find you?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, which is where you're seeing me right now. So connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can find all of my information on my website, jeenacho.com.
Thank you so much, Jeena. It's been amazing having you on the show today. Love you and have a great day. Thank you to everyone, Andrea, Amar, Karen. Appreciate all of you tuning in, and see you next week on Collect Our Cousins.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.